Okay. So for those who stayed after the last ceremony session, they will understand that sometimes being early is good, but I guess being on time is even better. So welcome to the panel on large language models or implications of large language models. So I think I will do it a bit shorter this time. So my idea is simply to say yesterday we had two exciting talks about intelligent behavior. And I think if you think about what is currently going on, many people think that large language models are maybe the answer to understand, to decipher, to find the DNA of intelligent behavior. And some other people, maybe not, who knows? But what we have to discuss are the implications of this amazing new technology that we have to understand. And so our idea was to invite several of the experts from within AI, AAAI, to understand what are their opinions about the implications of large language models. So we wanted to check with reasoning and planning. We wanted to check with programming. Can they help us with programming? We wanted to check with, can they maybe even help us to play text-based games or Minecraft? We want to maybe understand, are they at all factual? Can they be evaluated? Do they show economic behavior? So that's why we compiled this panel with different opinions, different expertise, moderated by Kevin. So Kevin, I'm looking forward to this panel and to understand better the implications of large language models.
Thanks very much. Thanks for coming here, in many cases twice, for this panel. We're all about punctuality and professionalism here at the Large Language Models panel, so nice to be here with you at 4:30. I'm Kevin Leighton Brown. I'm a professor of computer science at the University of British Columbia here in town. I work on machine learning applied to game theory, to constrained programming, and increasingly I also work in large language models as many people have started shifting. I'm going to begin by introducing the panel, and then I'll take a seat and start chatting with them all. So let me go from your left to your right. I'll begin with Chris Manning, who is a professor of linguistics and computer science at Stanford University and the director of the Stanford AI Lab. He's been developing neural approaches to natural language understanding since 2010, with recent work on variant neural architectures and new tools in the large language model toolchain, such as direct preference optimization. Next is Sheila McIlwraith, who is a professor at the Department of Computer Science at the University of Toronto, a Canada CFAR AI chair at the Vector Institute, and an associate director at the Schwartz-Rietzman Institute for Technology and Society. Sheila's research straddles knowledge representation and reasoning, automated planning, and machine learning, much of it through the lens of human-compatible AI. Sheila. Next is Charles Sutton. Charles is a research scientist at Google DeepMind and was previously a professor at the University of Edinburgh. For the past decade, he's worked on machine learning and large language models for generating source code and software engineering. Charles. Finally, last but not quietest, is Rao Kambhampati, who is a professor at Arizona State University. He works on planning and decision-making and explainable human-AI interaction. So, and I'm going to keep talking, but from a seated position. So we were tasked by the program chairs with a panel on the implications of large language models, and it was sort of left up to us to understand exactly what that meant and what sorts of implications we were going to be speaking about. And so when our panel met and thought this over, we decided to focus on two different kinds of implications. So the second kind of implications is implications on the broader society, the sort of moral, social, ethical implications of large language models, which we'll speak about in the second part of our panel. The first kind of implications that we'll begin by speaking about are implications on the the research community, and in particular on the AAAI research community. So we're conscious of the group that we're addressing, and we would like to structure the first part of our conversation around what does the advent of large language models mean for this group? If you're a researcher in artificial intelligence who chances are wasn't working on large language models 4 years ago, what does it now mean for the rest of your career, for the direction of the field that we're all part of, that large language models have achieved the explosive success that they have? So that's the question that I'm going to be inviting the panel to think over together. Two brief general remarks before we dive in. The first is just sort of a matter of terminology. We were assigned the term large language models, and we may use the term LLMs or we may use other terms, but we consider ourselves generally to be talking about large pre-trained foundation models of whatever kind, whether they be based on language or whether they be multimodal or sort of other versions. I think we all agree that while the initial explosive success has been particularly prominent around language, the general phenomenon is broader than language. And secondly, I think everyone here, like I think most reasonable people in AI, thinks that large language models are amazing and transformative and insufficient for meeting the goals of AI in their current forms. So it's not the case that we have some people here who think that scale is all you need, and other people here who think that absolutely this is all garbage and none of it is going to work at all. Instead, we're going to be really trying to probe that nuance and have a more interesting conversation about what's going on. Among our panelists, let me start with Chris, who's sitting right beside me. Among our panelists, Chris is maybe the most directly identified with the linguistics community, with the sort of NLP community, and although I know Chris is a deep thinker who has nuanced views about everything, I wonder if I can prevail upon you to make the sort of positive case for large language models being a radical transformative moment for AI.
Absolutely. I really think a lot of the time we're understating the positive case. I mean, there are a handful of people who spend a lot of time on social media telling you, well, denigrating large language models and telling you that they can't do anything well. And they put out a lot of tweets. But I think we really should be appreciating that these devices are just amazing, right? There are people all over the planet now using large language models for all kinds of productivity tasks, and they just work great for them. I mean, that, all sorts of tasks that either would, take you an excruciating hour, or for other people that need to find a data scientist or spend a week writing something, you can just ask a large language model to do it and it will do it. Getting closer to AI research, like back in the 2010s, one of the things I worked on was information extraction. So getting facts out of pieces of text, like this person works for this company and things like that. I'm almost embarrassed to admit now, but I spent years with graduate students working on these information extraction tasks, and we did evaluations every year, and our accuracy, we only got out about half the facts, and year after year the numbers barely budged. Right now, here we are in 2023, and for tasks like that, you can just say, here's a 100-page PDF. Large language model, can you read this and get out all of the facts of people and their jobs, and can you format a JSON file for me and give it back to me? And that takes me 20 seconds rather than 3 years to build a system, and it works way better than what we had last decade. So I think we should take the time to be impressed. I honestly think that if you're not sitting and thinking, wow, what I can do now with these large language models, or what I can do with other large foundation models, so image generation models, video generation models, image understanding models, if you're not just sort of blown away by the fantastic progress and how much these models can do, I honestly think you have no soul, that you've got no heart in this enterprise of being excited about seeing AI technology.
So yeah, let's assume for the sake of argument that the thousands of people who showed up for this panel think that there's something exciting going on with LLMs, and controversially, we can maybe even assume that they have souls. Although maybe I'll get some pushback from my panel on that. But moving a little bit more tangibly, what do you think this means for what the AI research community going forward? If people themselves have been working for 3 years on tasks that now take 20 seconds, should we just call it a day? Is this the last time we need a AAAI, or is there going to be something useful for all of these bright minds to be doing?
I think there's lots useful for them to be doing. I mean, if there's anybody that should be most worried about being out of a job, I guess it's natural language processing people, because that's where the most progress has been made. But I think there too, there's a huge number of things to do, right? So this has certainly changed the research frontier markedly, and it means that there are all sorts of things that it wouldn't be a good idea to get into if you're a young graduate student. I would kind of disadvise you getting into writing information extraction systems that try and get facts about which jobs people have out of text. Probably not a good PhD thesis. But, at the same time, there are just tons and tons of new problems that have arisen because of these developments. We have issues of, how can we get these models to hallucinate less? How can we get them better to work in accord with human preferences? How can we start to use these models to reason and plan more effectively than they can at the moment? So there's this huge, sort of this new era of problems that are now opening up because we have this really good foundation of a foundation model. And so I think we just should be excited because we can build on that foundation.
So Rao, let me bring you in here. You've expressed some more provocative public views, including at a tutorial earlier at AAAI, where, if I understand right, you've made an argument that there are some inherent limitations to what we should expect from LLMs, particularly around topics like reasoning and planning. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so first of all, I just want to make sure that everybody understands that I'm very pro LLM. I actually sell t-shirts about LLMs, one of which I'm wearing right now.
No product placement,
so I do not want people to somehow think that the LLM, I'm an LLM Luddite or something. So I think LLMs have just amazing development that we have been privileged to see. They've become a giant external non-veridical memory for the entire humanity. It's become sort of a system one for all of us that we could depend on. And the fact that you could get that by just pre-training on the web data for gazillions amount of compute is something that has taken all of our intuitions for a spin. We just did not. I don't think even people, when like Amodai, for example, tried GPT-3, I don't think they were really expecting it at that level of performance. One interesting thing is when our intuitions take a spin, we tend to think that everything that was not possible is now completely possible. And we have to be somewhat careful about that. As I said, I believe that LLMs are an amazing external non-veridical system once, but the system two competencies largely escape them. They're the masters of form and style, but not of factuality and content. And this is actually where I think there are beautiful ways in which the AAAI community and what has been called the NeurIPS community can actually come closer, much closer. For the longest time, the word knowledge-based meant it's some sort of a go-fi thing that we should not be talking about. Certainly, they would not use the word knowledge-based in NeurIPS papers, and that would only come to AAAI. if you look at it right now, most of the research natural science that is being done with LLMs in terms of can we use it in various types of reasoning-ish tasks and so on, they wind up actually using LLMs as approximate knowledge sources, and they build on top of that. Sometimes, unfortunately, with not any disrespect to them, they may not have taken an intro to AI or a logic course, and so they might be reinventing the wheel. But this community, on the other hand, actually does have that kind of a background. And so I really believe that there is beautiful synergies in actually getting LLMs as approximate knowledge sources and putting them together in knowledge-based systems. You can't just assume that whatever they come out with is actually already accurate and correct. That would be a big mistake. In fact, that's the tutorial that I wound up giving in terms of their planning and reasoning abilities. But I also talk about a very constructive way of putting together LLMs with verifiers, with both content verifiers and style verifiers, such that, in fact, you can actually do things that we couldn't do before. And so that's basically the kind of synergy that I'm hoping we will be talking about, rather than just saying LLMs are zero-shot XXXS, because those are the papers that will be confined to the dustbin of AI research, in my view.
Thanks, Rao. Sheila, your background is also rooted in planning and knowledge representation, as is Rao's. But you've expressed, a little bit more optimism, at least in the conversations that we had together. And I know also you maybe are a bit more focused on the KR community as compared to Rao. So I wonder, how what you've been hearing so far lands for you, and maybe in particular, what you think from KR and from other sort of historical areas of focus in the AAAI community, LLM technologies are going to need going forward.
Sure. So thank you. Large language models are a sea change. They're really revolutionizing the way that we're practicing our research and the types of questions that we're asking. So I don't know about many of you, but I feel like I've transitioned from becoming a mathematician to becoming a little bit of an experimental scientist. We've created these artifacts, and now we're poking and prodding them to try to understand what behavior they can do and what they can't do, and trying to understand how we can add value. I think to those of you who are my colleagues in the audience who do symbolic reasoning, I don't think we're out of jobs yet. I think there will always, although in the future, I believe that we will probably interact with systems largely using natural language. There's still a need in safety critical systems for the precision that is given to us by using formal methods and formal systems. And I think that that's an important thing to remember. And Rao talked about that, I think, in the context of planning, but more generally, we will need to audit these systems. We will need to verify properties of those systems. And I think that many of the things, the techniques that we've developed over the last 50 years in KRNR and in related fields will really come to bear. I also think there's a lot of relational data that will just be naturally manipulated in the way that we've classically done, both using logical methods and constraint satisfaction and various other techniques, satisfiability, but also probabilistic Bayes nets and other things like that. But of course, the interesting question is what value some of the great work by very smart people has going forward with respect to large language models. And I think that one of the things that when I reflect on the KR community in particular and think about what we've been doing, I think we've really been studying the science of artificial intelligence and the science of intelligence using a particular mathematics, but really gaining insights about what intelligence is and how to represent knowledge and how to take compact, explicit knowledge and draw out what's implicit in it through reasoning. And of course, in first order logic is a great example of that. In a knowledge-based system, you might write, and there's a nice panel on knowledge-based systems, I guess, tomorrow in honor of Doug Lennett, but we'd write down a set of sentences and recognize that it was an incomplete description of the world, but it often would represent an infinite number of different ways the world can be if you're using first order logic. And we were able to use entailment to understand what could be said that was true or false about the world using those types of practices. Of course, the AI community looked at common sense reasoning, how we would actually capture common sense reasoning, things like default reasoning, or simple things like closed world assumption. If I show you the people who are in my class, I know that Kevin is not in my, I can infer that Kevin is not in my class, not because the sheet of paper says that Kevin's not in my class, but because I have a closed world assumption that anybody who's not in my class is or not on the list is not in my class. And we've used that for all sorts of things to reason about change, how to parsimoniously represent change in the world, that most things stay the same. When I scratch my nose, it doesn't mean that everybody's socks turn purple, or that Kevin suddenly becomes grows a beard, that things mostly stay the same. And so we've recognized this relationship between representation and knowledge. One more thing, yeah, just really quickly, sorry, because I'm talking a lot. I think there's a lot that we contribute with respect to agentic AI and agentic foundation models representing knowledge and belief, representing the distinction between epistemics, what we know that other people know, and really the important distinctions between what's true in the world, what we think in our heads, and what we think that other people think in their heads. And just as a closing, I guess, I always tell my students that if you have a robot and you tell them to go to the red door, and they only see a blue door, but they have a can of paint, they shouldn't go and paint the door red and then go to and then go through the door. That there's an important distinction between epistemics and knowledge and what's true in the world, and that those sorts of things are really important to that, and I think things that the KR community can give to large language models.
I was really just trying to ask a follow-up question.
Oh, sorry.
I just want to, you've, I think, articulated very clearly a bunch of different ways where KR has something marginally to add over kind of the LLM type systems we have today. I guess I wonder whether you see these kinds of KR approaches as alternatives that we would use instead of LLM-based systems, or whether you see kind of some kind of synthesis of these two approaches, and if the latter, if you have any thoughts about how the synthesis would look.
Yeah, I see a plurality. I think there are people who are really interested in this AGI experiment, who are trying to build systems and just see how far they can get in emergent intelligence. But I think that, and that's an interesting line of pursuit. But I think we also have to solve practical problems, and we will engineer those practical problems in ways that make sense for us. Rao has talked about this, I think, a term that he coined, LLM modulo theories, where we use an LLM plus some sort of external reasoner, maybe that's very good at constraint satisfaction, or some sort of other process that is more exact. So I think I see a plurality of different things that are going to occur.
Thanks. Let's get to Charles. So, Charles, many people have claimed publicly that Codex was a big turning point in the evolution of large language models, where training on a large code base sort of at least correlated and maybe caused an impressive change in the LLM's ability to reason. And it seems like code is a particularly interesting kind of data that we have a lot of, that it encodes procedural knowledge that can be executed. And I know you've thought a lot about this sort of intersection between LLMs and code. So I wonder what you think about what you've been hearing so far, and maybe specifically around reasoning as it pertains to code, what you think is still needed to make LLMs into a reliable tool.
Sure. First I have to begin by saying, like all of the other panelists, that I love LLMs, and some of my best friends are large language models. Nobody told me I could sell T-shirts while I was up here. I don't know what's up with that. But
I tried to say no product placement, but they were cutting my mic.
Yeah, filthy lucre here. But and it's interesting that both Sheila and Rao have talked about kind of interactions between symbolic methods and knowledge representation and reasoning. That comes up very much in programs, because we're accustomed to analyze programs, especially in security and safety critical contexts, using formal methods. So it's kind of natural to say, well, LLMs have this like embryonic reasoning capability. So maybe I used to think of pattern recognition and reasoning as being two separate things. And when I saw chain of thought reasoning and stuff like that, then I started to think, oh, maybe reasoning is just iterated pattern matching. So I think there's a large potential space of hybrid methods that we can think about. Maybe the reasoning is all in the LLM, or maybe we try to use a formal system to constrain it or combine them in some other way. But depending on how much, this is an issue where depending on how much coffee I've had, I take a very different view about whether it's a good idea or not. Like sometimes I get, kind of excited by this work that people are doing on neurosymbolic systems, sometimes I even write papers on it. And then other times I think about symbolic methods, like you mentioned Doug Lennett. I actually worked for the Psych Project for a year. So I had some involvement, but then I think, well, if I think about, like, say, formal methods, if I think about formal logic, right? Formal logic has had a 2,000-year history of overpromising and under-delivering. Like, I mean, if you think, I'm serious, like think the Aristotle, right? And syllogisms were introduced as a normative method of human reasoning, and yet no one in the history of human ideas has convinced anyone of anything using a syllogism, right? So maybe
That sounds like a syllogism.
it is not. It is absolutely not. So you think, okay, maybe kind of LLMs, this kind of system one reasoning complements symbolic methods, but maybe we're just trying to kind of resurrect a technology that's had difficulty scaling. Like LLMs are really good at scaling, symbolic methods, that's been a challenge. So I think there are definitely opportunities there. I'm not telling you not to work on it, but I think there's reasons for skepticism too, and depending on what day of the week it is, I go back and forth.
I guess I want to dig in a little bit more to what you were saying about the sense that pattern recognition and reasoning might be two things or might be part of the same thing. You sort of invoked this idea of, maybe it's just iterated pattern recognition. I think in the AI community, something that this community over time has thought a whole lot about is algorithms for performing reasoning that are a whole lot more powerful than iteration. And so I wonder, do you think that algorithmic lens is important, or do you think if the pattern recognizer is good enough, then iteration is all we need?
Oh,
is that the next paper we should
write?
What
kinds of methods are you thinking about, for example?
I really mean just anything, like constraint propagation algorithms, for example, doing something polynomial time that's rich, linear programming. People have just thought about, algorithmic approaches for drawing a conclusion that are a lot more than a for loop.
Okay, so like I said, it depends what day of the week, how much coffee I've had, the view that I take on this. So the one view I could take is that iterated pattern matching doesn't mean you're doing the same thing over and over again. It might mean you're iterating through a step-by-step procedure. And in fact, if you ask, I'll make a bet because I haven't tried this. Like if you asked, well, no, I shouldn't do simplex. But if you asked, say, a large language model I could do a Google product placement. Is that allowed?
Oh my God, you people.
So if you ask your favorite large language model, which I hope is Gemini, to say, oh, step through the resolution algorithm in a small example and do reasoning, it'd probably do it. And I can say that as a bet because I haven't actually tried it. So I think if you view it broadly enough, it's possible. Like, I don't know about, linear programming would be harder because doing actual numerical computations.
Raul looks like his head is about to explode.
Okay, yeah, good.
So I think I agree with actually one thing that he said, which is already progress, I think, on this panel, that basically you could actually talk about the importance of that. When people say LLMs are doing reasoning and some other people disagree with it, it seems to be connected to sort of the ability to unfold an advice and sort of operationalizing the advice. And most of the things like the chain of thought reasoning seem to have been used in examples where there's very little unfolding that is actually done by the LLM, which is why I don't think that actually resolution theorem proving it actually steps through it. We did this very little experiment trying to kind of give a chain of thought to blocks world. You could do it at the domain independent level. You can do it at just the blocks world level. You can do it at the exact goal class level. You can do it at the exact same specific goal level. The only place COT works is the exact same specific goal, with the goal state always having a stack going from A to Z. everywhere else, it's unable to follow advice. So in general, one thing, if I might say that, is as great as LLMs are, anthropomorphization of LLMs has been their bane. I mean, the late Drew McDermott wrote this thing called Artificial Intelligence Meets Natural Stupidity. And it's again come back to visit us to some extent. Chain of thought, one of the great things is we do tell people, okay, here is the procedure, this is how you can follow it. And at some level, it looks like that is the kind of thing LLM is doing, but it actually is unable to because it doesn't really unfold most of the time.
Sheila, do you have anything to say about that?
I do. Actually, I'm going to repeat something that somebody else did. How many people in the audience think that LLMs can do reasoning? Not that many. I guess it's not a well defined question. But for me, as somebody who comes from the knowledge representation community, what I think of as reasoning is making something that's implicit explicit. And by that very nature, I don't think that LLMs are doing all forms of reasoning. I don't think they're doing constraint satisfaction, puzzle solving, problem solving. But I do believe that they are doing some form of reasoning by making things that are implicit explicit. So maybe we're just arguing about terminology, and whether we argue about what chain of thought does or tree of thought or other things. I do believe that there is some inherent reasoning that is going on, and I believe that we will see more of it as we see the next generation of foundation models or language models.
Thanks. I want to get to social impact of all of this, but before I do, I want to give the last word to Chris. Any thoughts about all of this?
Yeah, so I think we're still in a glass half full situation. But the thing to remember is that the large language models you're using right now are the worst large language models you'll ever use in your life. And this year's ones, GPT-4 or Gemini, are a long way ahead of last year's ones already. And so specifically for reasoning, I think there's absolutely no doubt that these models can do reasoning steps well. I mean, a recent paper that showed that nicely was by Saparov and which showed that you could give these models made up scenarios and have them do reasoning steps. So that's the start of reasoning. Now, where do they fall down at the moment? They fall down in doing planning and exploration. So the kind of simple autoregressive models that chain something out clearly aren't sufficient to do all parts of reasoning. So there's still some stuff we need to invent, but we're on the pathway to having these large models reason.
Okay, thanks. So let's imagine we take that pathway a little bit further, and then our whole society has to deal with the consequences. Let's think that through. And I want to start with you, Sheila, because you're the Associate Director of the Schwartz-Reisman Institute for Technology and Society. So you're maybe best positioned among the five of us to try to contextualize the sort of social landscape here. What should we be thinking about when we think about social impact here?
Yeah, so I suspect there are people in the audience who are more expert than I am, but I will share my opinion. And I think one way that I often think about framing the problem is both with respect to thinking about the development of large language models, and then also about their deployment and use. And even with respect to the development of language models, there are a lot of issues that we need to think about and worry about or help be stewards of, so that they are done responsibly. So if you even think about developing a large language model, where does that data come from? Whose data is it? And privacy concerns about whether you're going to expose that data inadvertently in whatever artifact you build. Certainly there are issues nowadays about access to data, access to compute, access and the implications on power consumption and the environment of large compute, as we see countries all over the world trying to get more compute so that they can build their AI systems. Also at the universities, we're seeing that we don't have the compute for our students to be able to train them, but that's an issue perhaps we'll discuss later. Certainly with respect to deployment, I think we often think about deployment with respect to different sectors or the impact on different on jobs or on the economy or on education. But I think we also need to sort of step back and think about what impact it's going to have on what society are we building, and what is society going to be like with the proliferation and adoption of some of these technologies. And in particular, we can see that with respect to some of our infrastructure, with respect to our electoral systems, with respect to our banking systems, we want to make sure that we are preserving the trust in those institutions. With respect to our interactions with each other, we want to make sure that we're preserving trust in each other and in our communities, both small and large. Chris made this comment, I think, when we were just chatting earlier in the day, that it used to be the case that you could walk down the street and or go about your business relatively anonymously, and now more and more we are losing our anonymity. We are being watched, and we are perhaps losing as generations move on. Care and concern about that, but we can see that totalitarian states can exploit these technologies systematically and in ways that are concerning to human rights. And I think that those are things that we as stewards of this technology need to really lean in and think about.
Yeah, from what I understand, there are cameras on all the streets in Britain, even though I think most people think post-Brexit Britain is not yet a totalitarian state. But let's kind of go to the whole panel and try to think through kind of one by one some of these key social issues that people tend to be concerned with. And I guess I'll begin each one by turning to one panelist, but maybe we'll get two or three other panelists sort of weighing in on each topic, and we'll quickly kind of go through several different topics that are important. Rao, let me start with you. Let me address maybe the topic that we hear about the most when we talk about the dangers that LLMs might pose, which is misinformation or deep fakes or other forms in which content generation could lead to social harm through the fraying of trust and all of that. What's your take on those issues?
I think that's so. As I said earlier, we have sort of evolved to conflate form with content, and it worked for us. We keep saying things like beauty is truth, etc., etc. So a well-written form of text might probably be correct, and this worked for most of the time in our civilization. That's just completely out as of last 3 years. Every email all of us are getting is so well written that I almost wish for a badly written email from some of you, so that I hope that actually people are still writing themselves.
The audience can take this as a challenge.
Yeah, please do. Please do. I think in this era, a badly written original idea might actually stand out way more than extremely well written GPT-4 stuff, which I believe always has the shibboleth called I delved into. Delve apparently is a thing that GPT-4 put. So if I have delve, it goes into spam for my... So in general, I think this style content conflation is going to be a huge issue. We evolved for that. It's not going to be easy for us to change that easily. And to some extent, I guess we're talking about multimodal too. If you start talking about multimodal, if you see somebody's farm actually talking, then you just assume it is them. And, that has been given all these voice fakes, deep fakes, and, voice scamming calls. Arizona, where I come from, for some reason has become the ground zero. Apparently, lots of people are getting loved ones calling, asking for money, etc., except it's just a deep fake voice. I don't know. I think things like watermarking, etc., have been talked about. I think it's a worthwhile thing to try and do. But I actually like something that Tom Dietrich most recently pointed out, which is eventually there's going to be so much misinformation that is being developed, done by even if the responsible good people like Google's and OpenAI's actually watermark, somebody else can. There's so many different ones, and so we ultimately have to learn to distrust our senses and require provenance for the information that we are getting, which is hard when your mom or somebody with your mom's voice is calling you, asking you to help out, saying, can you please give me your cryptographic authentication, is not the most romantic thing, but we will have to do it. And the second thing is that we just really need to start authenticating things that we send. The good information should be authenticated rather than saying LLMs, the thing that is produced by LLMs should be authenticated, because that's much harder to control. So, but on the whole, this misinformation is going to be a huge, huge problem, I think. But I'm really hoping that it's going to be a transition period. Humans, one of the most important, most amazing things about us is we get adopted. We adapt ourselves to the technology. So right now we fall for these scams, but very soon I think we might outgrow. But the transition period is going to be very hugely problematic. And yes, that's going to be a big issue.
So broadly speaking, you're saying that you think it's going to be necessary for people to learn to distrust otherwise reputable seeming information. Some people might say that, in the last 10 years, people distrusting reputable seeming information has been a big social problem, around public health advice, about decisions, in elections, about, what the outcome was, about whether global warming is a real thing. Is this kind of distrust, of a different kind? Is it going to push us further down the slope that we're going down?
So first of all, I think I do think that the old idea that message is more important than the messenger, that ship has passed, I think, at the time of Greeks. And certainly messenger and the reputation of the messenger matters. And I keep thinking that these trustworthy, whatever the news sources, etc., where is this particular piece of information is coming from, is going to be important. The point you are making is that some people would like alternate realities, to put it forth. So there may very well be alternate news sources, and they might want to just believe that. But that's still much better than GPT-4 essentially writing text where you have no idea which part came from where. So I think we really have to admit that I still am surprised that people would think that they would like to search for factual information not by Google, but apparently reading, calling Google and looking at the search engines is so hard for them. They would much rather have ChatGPT make up stuff and hope for the best. And that's where my t-shirt comes, which is, if you don't know what the answer is, all you are reading is it well-written piece of information? And so you have no idea. When I am being hypochondriac and I want to figure out whether or not the thing that I'm having is worrisome, I go to CDC, not just ask ChatGPT, because how do I know what is it saying? And so the actual reputation of the source from which the information is coming from is going to be extremely important. And for those of you who have shares in New York Times and newspapers, maybe you will see some rise in those stocks, because I think it actually becomes important where the message is coming from, not just whether the message is well written and compelling. And that actually goes back to this idea that these systems can really, really convince you of their point of view. That doesn't mean that they're right.
I'm warning, all the panelists and all of you now that clearly we could have a panel on every single one of these topics that we're going to bring up. So I'm going to shift gears, although there's much left to be said, so that we can cover a few more topics. Charles, let's talk about the world of work. What should we expect about impacts on the labor market, about LLM technology and AI technology more broadly as it goes forward, and take some of your advice from the previous round? How worried should we be? How big are the changes going to be? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question, because software engineering is one of the first industries where we're starting to see LLMs be using routinely. And it's also one that's kind of used to and welcomes automation. So it's an interesting source of analogies. The real answer to your question, of course, is I don't know. Anybody who tells you that they know what's going to happen with large models in the next 6 months is trying to sell you something. Hold on to your wallet. I could see reasons to believe that there'll be positive and negative effects on the labor market. So to talk about the positive effects, I can say, taking software engineers, like think about compilers. You could imagine that if we didn't have compilers, that would be great for the software engineering industry, because now I have to write everything in assembly, so it takes much more labor to write a piece of software. Maybe that means we have to hire more programmers. Well, maybe, but I think in reality, it would just be so expensive that we'd write fewer programs. We wouldn't have the complex software that we have today. So it's actually adding automation to the industry actually means that it creates jobs in some cases rather than taking them away. So that's one. So there can be both positive and negative effects on whether people have, how many jobs there are. And the other thing, which was relating to some things that Rao said about style, is that I think norms about how people communicate, how people socially interact in work are going to change in ways that are difficult to predict now. So the joke that we make is, you know, I'm not going to write, nobody's going to write or read emails anymore, right? I'm going to write bullet points. I'm going to get Gemini to turn them into email. You're going to receive the email. You get Gemini to turn them into bullet points. You read the bullet points. And so, you know, probably that's not a steady state, right? So everybody knows that I can use Gemini to make my emails as polished and diplomatic as you like. So then maybe actually it's going to change professional norms. Like maybe sending a very short email with typos is going to seem like is much more respectful because, you know, I didn't use an LLM. I'm actually writing to you authentically. So there are going to be ways that we can't predict now that social norms are going to change.
So I think a question that a lot of people have is, you know, I've got a child who's just going into school now, and I'm just embarking upon my, you know, graduate degree. You know, how do I seek out an LLM robust career path for myself? You have any thoughts about that?
Plumbing is good. Yeah.
So is planning.
Yes. So, yeah, so it is kind of common to say that LLMs are, and to be, say in surprise tone of voice, that LLMs are disrupting white collar work more than blue collar work. Maybe we shouldn't have been surprised about that. So I think Dieter Fox gave a great invited talk this morning where he mentioned Moravec's paradox, which I would state it's easier to build a grandmaster chess player than it is to build a system that moves the pieces. Right. And so if you take that perspective, well, we shouldn't have been surprised that it was easier to automate some aspects of intellectual work. But I haven't yet seen an LLM that exercises good judgment. Right. So I think there's so there will be transformative aspects, but it's hard to say, are there particular career paths that will be, you know, completely removed? You know, a lot of what we do during secondary education isn't directly, you know, vocational training anyway. So I think it's, you know, it's hard to say.
Maybe just to add something to that myself, because I think the plumbing recommendation is just too depressing to leave as the last thought.
Plumbers are pretty happy.
Very important. I'm sure there's some very happy plumbers in the world, but I think maybe more fundamentally, I think there are a lot of jobs where we interact with another human, where it's inherently important to us in that job that it be another human that we're interacting with. Not because the human does it better, but because it is in fact a human. Whether this is a kindergarten teacher or a psychologist or an elder care worker or a personal trainer or, you know, this is sort of the list goes on of you know, an influencer on the internet, where it's kind of or novelist, right? Where somebody is, you know, sharing a human experience, and it matters to you that the experience be a human experience. And I would put out that, you know, maybe even in the kind of white collar space, we might see a shift to the human being important, not because it gets the task done, but because it matters to us that it be a human. Anyway, that's me on my soapbox. I'll shut up about that now. Instead, let me turn to Chris and ask a question about another social topic, which is alignment. So how should we think about alignment? Obviously, if we had a system that was entirely unaligned with human preferences, then it would be a, you know, weapon of mass destruction that might seek to make paper clips out of everything. On the other hand, if we have a system that is very rigidly aligned to the views of a small group of people, then we might become concerned about who gets to choose the alignment, and you know, this could be a problem of another kind. So how should we think about alignment going forward?
Yeah. So alignment refers to getting an AI system to follow the goals, preferences, and perhaps ethical principles of people. But I sort of have grown to hate the term alignment. I mean, part of why I hate the term alignment is, I think back to someone who was a 1990s spoken dialogue system designer. And well, if you were, designing a dialogue system in the 1990s, you sort of had a handwritten dialogue tree with regex matching or something like that. But what you were doing was you were aligning your dialogue system, meaning you were getting it to respond to human goals, like being able to check your bank balance or whatever it is. But so that was already, anyone that's done UX is doing alignment. They're trying to build computer systems that work according to human goals and preferences. But what has happened in recent years is that there's been this sort of enormous growth of this field of AI alignment, which has been dominated by this futuristic science fiction, fantasy, effective altruist thinking. And I don't really see that as the right path forward. I think, I think what's really going to determine how things work out here is whether human beings have concern and care for their fellow human beings. And the worrying thing about the way human society has been evolving is that more and more, a lot of human beings are in their own cocoons, looking at their devices, not interacting with other people because they don't use public transport anymore, or wearing headphones and all of these things. And, from that perspective, the kind of people who write and talk most about AI alignment, if I stereotypes and generalize slightly, they always strike me as these people who are sophists, who are interested in, complex logical arguments and counterfactual worlds, and care way less than the average person about their fellow human beings. And I think if we're actually going to make progress in having AI systems that work for humanity, we're going to have to involve the broader spectrum of humanity and people who care about other people and their legitimate needs and wants.
I think that's really beautifully said, and I think that's something we don't hear enough. Although I would say, if you're on the bus wearing your headphones, at least you left your house. Good for you. But more seriously, let's say I, like probably many people listening to you, find that to be an inspiring vision. What does it look like to try to put that into practice? What should we, as the AI research community, who maybe understands technology a lot better than we understand, society and the way that all of society makes decisions about difficult things, how should we play our part to realize the vision that you've laid out?
Well, I think there is actually starting to be a lot more awareness of these issues and a lot more people, right? Lots of young grad students these days are very interested in the social side of AI systems and computing. And I think it's sort of inviting that wider perspective that until recently, AI has been totally dominated by technologists who want to sort of play with the machines that they're building, where we have to realize that now these machines are being widely deployed and have broad social impacts, and that we have to be actively thinking about those impacts and how we want to design systems, talking about people who have more experience in thinking about systems in the world, and thinking about a broader space of people that, I guess computer science has this very hierarchical structure that people have many times sort of seen as almost a good way for the world to be, right? That among the sort of CS community, many people think that having a benevolent dictator for life is a good way to organize a social system. Whereas once we are talking about people's livelihoods and welfare, I think we have to understand that that's not a good way to organize a system, and we have to recognize and give voice to the great plurality of humans.
Thanks. So I have one more social impact question for the panel, after which we're going to open it up for questions. So this is my announcement to you that if you have a question, there are 3 microphones in the room. We'll alternate between them. Feel free to come up to a microphone and we'll welcome your questions, either technical questions or broader social questions. I'll ask all of the questioners to keep their questions relatively brief so that we can hear from as many of you as we can. And I'll ask you either to direct your question to a specific panelist, or else I'll ask 1 or maybe 2 panelists to respond to you, again, so we can get through hear as many voices here as we can. But before that begins, I did promise you one last social impact question, and that's for Sheila. A last kind of social topic that I think many people worry about, that maybe especially touches all of us in this room in a pretty direct way, is in education. So what are your thoughts about the impacts of LLMs on education?
Yeah, thanks. You and I talked about this a little bit, and I know it's an interest of yours as well. And many of us in this room probably are educators, and they've seen their students adopting, both their undergraduate students and their graduate students, really adopting large language models in a big way, both for code generation, for helping them understand how to write the abstracts of their papers or paper outlines, or even for I have a son who's a high school student who uses it to sort of help him summarize long papers. So it's clearly a tool that can accelerate and amplify what we do. And I think that thinking about students in public schools, just like we learned how to use the library, or how we learned how to do internet search, I think that arming the next generation of students with the ability to use these tools and use them effectively, like they use calculators, is going to be something that should be part of the educational system. But there's certainly challenges for universities, both in terms of how we conduct our classes, what we should be teaching people, and also how we should be assessing students. And then from the outside, how universities are going to be viewed as degree granting institutions. What is it that we can verify that we are teaching our students, so that if they have degrees, when I know I see people in the audience who work on AI in education, you can imagine a future in which large language models will be able to provide personalized tutoring, and that's a really interesting and application to contemplate. But I know you've been teaching an ethics in AI course, and maybe you can share some of the things with everybody else that you shared with me, because I thought you had some really interesting insights.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I guess my take on LLMs in education is that it's a pretty enormous problem for our practice of assessment. And we will, in retrospect, think it was a much smaller problem to education. I don't think the need for a population of educated people is going to go away because of LLMs. We're not going to want a society filled with educated, sort of much older 6-year-olds. We're going to want people to be educated maybe even more than they are today. And so I think the practice of education is going to surely have to continue. And I think right now, education, we're really missing the mark in terms of the potential for education. So I think we're going to seek ways of doing it better. However, the assessment problem is fundamentally kind of an economic problem. You want to ask the student to do something which is hard for them to do and easy for you to verify. And what LLMs have done is they've shifted that economics. They've made it easy to generate, and it's as hard to verify as it ever was. And so now, those of us who are educators are panicking because, it's now really difficult for us to perform that verification than we did before. And I think that's what we're really going to have to think creatively about. I think the enterprise of education, which we understand pretty well, I think is going to want to continue much as it has before. But I think the practice of assessment is going to be turned upside down. And I think one thing we're going to do as a mitigation is lock people in a room and make them take an exam without any computers. That's the sort of stick your finger in the dike kind of approach. And we'll do a certain amount of that, but I think that's only going to get us so far. I think the more exciting sort of forward-looking view, I think, is the advent of sort of the increase of the oral exam. because I think we understand that, getting somebody, sort of the like Oxbridge sort of model of, get somebody into your office and, really talk through with them about, the whole wealth of their knowledge in a, expansive way, really get them to understand, find out from them by probing them with difficult questions, what they understand. Incidentally, like Chris did when he gave me the oral exam at Stanford, which was a humiliating and terrifying experience for me. But it was sure a good way of performing an assessment. Well played, Chris.
You can get revenge on him now.
I know, right? But why do we not do that everywhere all the time? Because the economics don't work out there, right? It's really expensive to conduct an oral exam, and it just doesn't scale at all. So I think there's going to be an LLM research agenda that says, don't just make LLMs like we have today, where the paradigm is you ask it to do a thing and it does the thing for you. I think there's going to be a kind of flipped LLM paradigm that says the LLM is seeking to form a belief state about you, and it's asking questions about you so that in the end it can make an assessment about what you know. And I think that's going to be really a game changer for education. Anyway, there we go. I got ambushed by my own panel, and I had a chance to expound about something. Enough from us up here. Let's turn around and hear from the crowd. And I guess I'll start with the longest line. So let's hear from the people over there.
Okay. So one of the things Chris wrapped up with was pointing out that LLMs have evolved a lot just even the past year, and there are a lot of young people here. I'm sure considering what research project should I be looking at, given maybe that I'm thinking 4 or 5 years out. So I'd invite you guys to speculate on what you think might be a good research project, given the evolution of LLMs in 5 years. Is it superintelligence? How to interact with the superintelligence? Or I'm curious if anyone has any ideas on this.
So I wasn't around yesterday, but I imagine when Jan LeCun spoke, he spoke about how we needed world models and how current neural networks don't give satisfactory world models. I think that's actually,
damn, you're good.
I think that's actually right. And so, there are whole areas in which our current neural networks are very unsatisfactory. And so, to be making profound progress, you really want to be thinking deeply about some of those issues and saying, where are the fundamental problems and what different kinds of architectures and approaches could take AI up another notch. The problem with that is it's sort of a bit ambitious and risky for a PhD student. That's a little bit of bet the world and see if it works out. But I think that there are tons of shorter term things where there's just tons of opportunity, right? So that I think a large language model or other foundation model is like this powerful engine, but for it to be usable in the world, you have to build a lot of pieces around it to build more complex foundation model programs where you're putting things together in various ways and making compound systems, perhaps with other components like knowledge bases. And that hasn't really been explored. All of this stuff is so new. So I think there are lots of projects that PhD students can be embarking on, accepting where things are today and where they're heading.
I agree. I think world models is a reasonable thing to work on. I think, in terms of lots of things like, more technically, I think long-term memory is one that I think is interesting. Like right now, the preface, I feel like there's definitely opportunity, because when you look at the work, a lot of the work that's going on in industry, I think is super exciting, but a lot of stuff in LLMs is kind of variations on a set of ideas. So doing things that are more disruptive is something that should be a role for academia. I think right now, when we think about long-term memory, the current answer is kind of do retrieval augmented generation. And I think that has to be wrong, right? Because this isn't how human memory works. Human memory is generative. I think there's a lot of interesting things to do in planning and reasoning. And I think there is actually space to it is risky, like Chris was saying, but I think there's space to innovate in fundamental architectures. The pre-training phase of we're starting to come to the conclusion that transformers aren't particularly special. They're just the first thing that started to scale. So that means, maybe I hope we're not using transformers in 5 years. There's a good chance that we will, but there's also a good chance that we won't be. So thinking about kind of architectural innovation that's more data efficient, especially in the case when you're doing, for example, lifelong learning, is a potential avenue.
Sure, go for it.
So the way I tell my students, some of who are still doing PhDs, is if you have a doddering old uncle or aunt who seems to have approximate knowledge about everything and they would not shut up, what can you use them so that the accuracy would improve? They're great idea generators, but they don't have any guarantees about accuracy. One aspect of that is planning and reasoning that I brought up, but I do want to bring up this connection to the reasoning that happened earlier. This issue of whether or not LLMs can do, LLMs currently, that is auto-regressive LLMs, can do reasoning. In the immortal words of Sam Altman, for some definition of reasoning, they do some kind of reasoning. I think that you can't question. Okay, seriously. But in essence, I think LLMs are a breed of AI systems. These are broad and shallow AI systems. They do sort of maybe shallow sorts of reasoning. They were preceded by deep and narrow systems, which would do guarantees for only very specific areas. Nobody ever questioned, for example, AlphaFold or something, because it was deep and narrow system. The interesting question would be how to combine these broad and narrow and deep and shallow, broad and shallow and deep and narrow systems. And that's basically I think of LLMs as great idea generators. And they can generate ideas not just about plans in the case of planning, but also planning models, preference models, reward models, all sorts of things with no guarantees. And so the question then would be, how would you actually leverage that? And that is something that would actually be a worthwhile thing to look at.
Cool. I let that one go a little bit long because it was so squarely related to the topic of our panel, but let's try to speed it up a little bit going forward. So, because I really want to hear from all of these people who are lined up. I know it's a disheartening thing to be at the back of the line. Let's go here to the middle.
Hi. So in support of the last statement on reasoning, I just want to read out the numerical results of the reasoning part of a benchmarking paper we published a year ago on ChatGPT, ranging from the best performing task to the least performing task. So analogical 30/30, deductive 28/30, common sense 26/30, temporal 26/30, abductive 26/30, inductive 15/30, causal 24/30, mathematical 13/30, and multi-hop is the worst one. It's 8/30. So LLM, this is ChatGPT a year ago, can reason to some extent and sometimes. That's all.
Yeah, I agree that if you can get by with less, just a couple of hops of reasoning with no guarantees, yes, LLMs can do that. And there's all sorts of interesting, by the way, results about how MMLU can be gamed. MMLU has actually become the shaky foundations of trying to figure out whether or not LLMs are improving, and it's not the questionable benchmark there. One other thing is that when people keep saying LLMs can improve, they actually probably also mean that they don't have to be auto-regressive anymore. In that case, everything is possible. In fact, if Jan basically gets tons of money from Mark Zuckerberg and does what he wants to do, maybe some of these problems will go away. But for the auto-regressive ones, which is most of the GPTs and most of the Geminis, I think this is not going to change. The scale isn't going to change, reasoning capability.
Let's keep moving over to the left side of the room here.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the great panel, very insightful. I was actually preparing 2 questions about carbapenem, so I may ask the third. For the long models, there are lots of data being used, But I don't think the incentive mechanism is very good now. People generate data, but they don't get something back. So what do you think? How to make the incentive align with people's interest?
I can take it.
You go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I agree. This is a huge problem. I mean, we're going to see some big events in the coming year because, there's now well over a dozen large lawsuits against various of the companies, Stability, OpenAI, etc., about the fact that, they are stealing huge amounts of content and then getting financial value from it. And so we do need a new world order. But I think really we need to just rethink things. I mean, I think sort of 2-century-old ideas of copyright just aren't an adequate model going forward. Now, given the bad ability of the world to make new laws and conceptual frameworks in the 21st century, it's not clear what's going to happen. But it feels like one should have some form of attribution process, which leads down to then micropayments for people whose stuff is being made use of, but we just have nothing like that at the present.
Thanks. Let's go over here.
Thank you all for all of your great opinions and conflicts of opinion. I'm currently curious, as many of the people here are students or in some way still in education, where do you see the advancements of LLM in the next 10 years, say, creating new careers and positions?
So is this for general jobs or AI PhD student jobs? Those are very different, I think. I think certainly there are going to be very interesting implications for the general jobs themselves. And I do have something to say that something that you said earlier touched me because I keep thinking about it too, that there are some things that it's not just the efficiency, but the human connection that becomes important. And part of the reason, as you said so eloquently, is this economics didn't work out. We were too busy doing other things that actually required things. And since when that becomes very cheap, maybe the incentive structure hopefully will change, that things like taking care of your loved ones, with more time, etc., would actually be economically more feasible for you. And so that, I think, might be a good thing, that maybe we'll have more time for those. And of course, more time for writing papers. That's always a good thing to do. But as far as AI PhD students, who knows? I mean, really, it's very hard.
Yeah, I mean, generally economics says that when the price of something falls, consumption of it ought to go up, right? So we should expect that as LLMs make things that are currently expensive cheap, we're going to see more demand for those things at those lower prices. And there might be, increases in jobs in facilitating these things, even as their marginal costs have fallen. So I think that's something that's going to be really hard for us to wrap our heads around as this goes forward. Let's go to the middle.
I like a lot what Shayla said about hopes for symbolic systems. But when we think about LLMs, we cannot think about soundness or completeness or assurances. And I also ask both you and Chris, how important is semantics with respect to LLM's world? Who is the Richard Montague from this world now? What's the semantics? What's the meaning of that? And in computer science, meaning is extremely important, especially with respect to what Sheila said about reasoning and inference. Can we deal with a world where unsound inference and incomplete reasoning is okay in a science, in computer science?
I'll actually start to answer this question, and then I'm going to hand it over to Chris, because one thing I think that I think is great about large language models is that the symbols that we've been using, the words that we have historically used when we build systems, are now grounded in perception, and they are grounded in and they are interpreted in context through the semantics that's provided through deep learning through neural networks or deep learning systems. And I think that's actually really important. And even the knowledge representation community, we were talking about this before, that talks about the difficulty in interpreting terms. So, somebody's bald. If I have hair, at what point if I start pulling out my hair, at what point do I become bald? There are all sorts of terms that are vague. There are all sorts of terms that are interpreted in context. And I actually think that language models and the ability to interpret in context are going to really resolve some issues. But to your point about soundness and completeness is always with respect to the model. It is not with respect to the world. And so I think that it's important to make that distinction. So let me just now let Chris talk about Montague semantics.
Yeah, I mean, so I think we definitely don't yet have a Richard Montague for the semantics of language models or foundation models more generally, which shows, again, there are lots of opportunities for PhD students. But yeah, I think we're just never going to have the same kind of precise, artificially precise clean semantics that one used to have in traditional logical systems. I think we're going to have a sort of a messy, approximate context influence form of semantics. But I think that's also what human beings have. So I think there's no doubt at all that language models have semantics, and you see that even more clearly with the newer generation of multimodal foundation models where they show relations, between the world. You can hook them up live to a video camera and have them talking about what it sees in a scene, right? There's understanding of the world. Their semantics is sort of manifest as something they've learned. It's just we don't yet have very good tools for examining it and talking about it.
Only at the AAAI LLM panel do multiple people reference Montague semantics. Way to go. On the right here.
Thank you. So the question I had was, AI development right now has very vastly outpaced how we're looking into the ethical implications of this. And what we see as a result is these large LLMs have huge environmental impacts that are very negative. They have huge impacts on people whose artwork they've stolen. They've got a very big impact for disrupting, for good or bad, the labor market. Do you think there's a point in calling for a halt to this research until we can fully explore what those ethical concerns are and come to a democratic consensus on how to solve them?
So I agree with the fact that there are things that are not being well thought out, for sure. That, for example, the costs of generating and training these models, we are just hoping that they will be amortized, and instead of, waiting for the current one to be amortized, then, if you're Sam Altman, you'll say the next one will be $7.1 trillion. And then after that will be a few more $1 trillion. I am actually, the computer scientist, I'm extremely worried about, are you ever going to pay for your actual previous debt? That's an interesting question. But at the same time, I'm not as sure about what you mean by just saying, taking like a pause. I know that lots of these pause requests have been done. And it seems to me that having this discussion in parallel is a very reasonable thing to do than expecting that somehow people will pause. Even if you ask for a pause, who exactly is going to heed to your request? And not all actors are essentially under some particular jurisdiction. So I think it's very much reasonable that we should think about this, in parallel, but I don't know that pause is going to be effective. People tried it already, as you know. And
Yeah, I don't think a pause is effective either. I think that there are too many economic incentives, and that language models will continue to be developed, even if some people decide to pause. But there are constructive things you can do. And to the people who are looking for PhD topics, try to work on mechanistic interpretability to understand how these language models or these systems work. Work on watermarking to try to, and techniques for provenance or cryptography to protect people's individual property and knowledge product or artwork, so that their attribution can be traced back, or provenance can be traced back to them, and they can be remunerated in some reasonable way. Think about regulations. I think there are a lot of positive things that we can work on when we identify the things that are problematic, and to sort of push the needle forward. And we need computer scientists to do this because we're the ones who understand the technology.
I guess I want to briefly speak to that too, because I thought deeply about this when the pause petition went around, and I guess something that on the face of it, it seems so reasonable. It's not asking for a stop; it's asking for a pause. And I guess something that in addition to the points that others raised, that sort of occurred to me is that it was never really clearly articulated what would be happening during this pause, and how the world would be substantially different, after we resumed again after the pause. And in a sense, the pause would revert us to the previous period of all of human history when we didn't have large language models and we didn't figure any of these things out. And so I guess that led me to feel like it was maybe not the mechanism we should be looking for. But I think maybe rather than seeing it as a mechanism, our community should see this as a kind of cry of rage from society that is saying, we don't trust what you guys are up to. We don't think this thing is an unequivocal force for good. We're really worried about where it's coming, and we want to make sure that a broad range of perspectives are taken into account as this thing is brought into the world. And I think, leaving the mechanism aside, I think we should take that expression of concern very seriously as a community. Let's go over here.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, the panel, for an interesting and wide-ranging conversation. Given the success of LLMs, should we perhaps not be concluding that we overestimated human intelligence, that a lot of human communication is quite formulaic, and it took a lot of data, but we've taught those formulas now to machines? And if so, should we not conclude that we should be focusing more on problems where we don't and perhaps can't have lots of data, coincidentally, which are mostly problems involving reasoning?
So I'm not sure. First of all, you do realize, I'm sure you're probably asking this question with your tongue firmly in cheek, but most of what LLMs have been trained on is the collective consciousness that we exported to the web. So so is that even possible if in fact humans weren't there? That's a very reasonable question. And the sorts of things that at least the autoregressive LLMs are unable to do, such that we can still do of many types of system 2 competences. It's not very clear whether additional data is going to be helpful and what sort of additional data is going to be available. I think this is just a great orthogonal piece of technology that we have available, and we can use this, but I'm not sure that it's going to change my questions as to whether, like if I want to understand human intelligence, if I want to understand human level capabilities, you can still be interested in doing that. And I think that's a very reasonable pursuit in my view. I don't think LLMs have changed that.
Charles, did you want to get in?
Yeah, sure. So I guess I dispute the kind of reasoning behind the question. I mean, the LLMs have access to a source of information that humans haven't. Like, I haven't read the entire internet. Maybe if I did, I would talk like ChatGPT. Yeah. So I wouldn't necessarily think, oh, LLMs managed to produce great text, it must be easy. I think communication is pretty hard.
Yeah. We let it go?
Yeah, I just wanted to say two very quick things. I think all of us, if you're in AI, you always think about how you think. And so it is the case, I think, for many of us that many of us ask ourselves whether we're really just, next open prompt generators. And it's an interesting question. And certainly there are people in cognitive science who would claim that is indeed the case. But to your point about data that's not very evident, one thing that worries me about our models is that we're training on, at least where Twitter is concerned or X is concerned, we are just training on the worst of humanity. And I worry that we are
Sorry,
not.
Rao.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm on
Sorry,
Twitter.
Rao accepted.
I'm helping quite significantly, but it's not helping enough.
Well, but where, our humanity is not expressed in its full tenderness. And to Chris's point, I think as well, you think about the interactions between a parent and a child or a caregiver. Those things are not captured in the data, or even our thoughts and our emotions. And those are things, to your point, that are really difficult for us to get data on. And I think in order to create large language models that are really going to be aligned with human values, that are be able to understand humans and to be understood by humans, that we are going to have to get our handle on how we're going to deal with that sort of data impoverished part of humanity.
Yeah, so I do.
Sorry about the Twitter.
I do think that there is a natural experiments that already is in progress. That GitHub and maybe even LinkedIn, GitHub in particular, the data is much cleaner. Very few of you put your non-working, exception generating programs on GitHub. Whereas web, for good reasons, general web contains all sorts of stuff. It's not very clear to me that we can control that, but that's the interesting part. We don't stop. Human kids are not educated by saying you should be closing your eyes when you are outside of the home and you only get to listen to the parents. We also tell them how to, even though you're getting all sorts of data, how exactly are you going to use your own judgment? As I think Charles was putting earlier, LLMs obviously don't have a judgment yet, and they are essentially going to repeat what they have said, and so they have seen the distribution they have seen, and that leads to this problem of how are you going to stop people from writing? There's no 4chan yet for GitHub. I'm going to wait for 4chan for GitHub and would love to see what happens to the code pilot at that time.
We've still got people standing up. I want to hear from more questions. Go ahead.
Sure. So yesterday, Jan LeCun pointed out the issue of the geometric rate of failure for transformer architectures. Every time they predict something new, there's a small chance that they fail. We humans seem to avoid this pitfall by concretizing our ideas with our heads. So any student that's taken a math class understands the feeling of having a fuzzy understanding of something and then having it click, and suddenly, everything starts to make sense. That seems to suggest that our brains are creating the neurosymbolic representations of abstract concepts. And so, you mentioned, Charles, earlier about treating it like pattern recognition, sort of in that sense. The fact that GPT can freak out and exhibit schizotypal personalities if their parameters tune wrong on one day, bonus points to Gemini for avoiding that issue, it suggests that that's not what's happening within transformer architectures. So what do you all see as the way we can get these large language models to actually begin to incorporate real concepts rather than just loose approximations, and have that not just be built on top of the model that's already there?
Charles, you were referenced. Do you want to take it?
Yeah, I'll take a little bit, but I'll be very brief. So this might not be something about the transformer, right? To get this kind of course-defined reasoning, like we say, oh, these guys are just doing next token prediction. That could be very rich depending on what the tokens are. So it could be that there are some intermediate representations that are like, VQ-VAE style things that get you this kind of like course-defined type of like, oh, I think I know what the idea is in a fuzzy sense.
Thanks. Let's keep moving. I want to get as many questions as we can. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you for the great panel. So my question is about the effect of large language models on language itself. So when usually we're speaking about the effects of large language models, we're first thinking about job market and similar. But every technology, or many technologies, change how humans use language. And in a world where a growing amount of language, be it text or speech, is going to be machine written, how is this expected to affect human-to-human communication and the content, or like the grammar of English and other languages themselves?
Can I take that one? So to make a prediction about that, so a lot of human language change is driven by young people, and young people want to create social cohesion among their groups by having a kind of a distinctive language that they communicate in. And so those young people are, agents of change and resistant to the homogenization that comes from sort of human tools that cause it. Like many people predicted that once there was television, right, that all regional accents would disappear because you'd hear on the national news the way to speak your language and everyone would speak like that and it'd be completely uniform. But that's precisely not what has happened because of these powerful factors that young people create group identification by continuing to change. And so, just as you might think of something like the creative ways in which different subcultures use emoji for different meanings, I think we'll continue to see people innovating in language regardless of what's inside the latest large language model.
So the program chairs told me that we could maybe go a few minutes over if we had a lot of questions. Would you like us to take the last questions, or should we end it here? I think I'm seeing a gesture that suggests that we should not eat into the poster time, which I think is maybe a good call. So let me just end by noting to all of you that never say the AAAI can't turn on a dime. The poster session downstairs is now organized by topic rather than in chronological order of when the paper was submitted. So if you were going to avoid the poster session because of that factor, I encourage you to go downstairs and see the great deal of fantastic work that's being showcased there. For those of you who had a question that you didn't have a chance to ask, feel free to come up afterwards and the panel will stick around. Let me thank again my fantastic panelists and all of you for sticking through with us. Thanks very much.